Hello, everybody. My name is Pat Flynn, and I am here with Kevin Symonds, and we have been asked to provide a case for Catholicism. And we are going to focus in on the miracle of Fatima and why we think this is good evidence for the truth of the Catholic faith, what we might call the Catholic hypothesis. And by the Catholic hypothesis, I mean the core creedal beliefs that are within the Catholic tradition and one can find in the Catholic Catechism. So, Kevin, thank you for joining me for this project. It's a delight to have you here, and it was a little bit providential because I was planning on doing this video, and it just so happened that you're putting together a course on Fatima. So I figured let's join forces and talk about how Fatima sort of confirms Catholicism in a sense, or at least it adds strong support to the Catholic paradigm and worldview. So thanks for teaming up with me on this, good sir.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been a while since we were together here on a program, so it's good to be back with you once more.
Yeah. So let's not make any assumptions because I know for William's audience, neither of us
No pun intended, by the way.
Yeah.
Let's not make any assumptions. No pun intended.
Yeah. Very good. Yes. Start off with a little humor. It's great. So for those who are not familiar with either myself or Kevin, I am somebody who worked my way out of an atheistic background and got religion, as they say. I'm one of those people who got religion, came fully into the Catholic Church. I'm sort of your classic story of somebody who a little bit of philosophy took me away from religion and faith at a fairly young age. And then as I went deeper, it eventually brought me back. And the short of my story is I really did find that the Catholic worldview made the best sense of a wide range of experience and data that I felt was non-negotiable, that had to be explained, that had to be accounted for. And many of my considerations, Kevin and gentle listeners, were philosophical considerations that converged upon the Catholic faith. And maybe I'll just indicate a few of those here. We're not going to spend most of our time on these considerations, but I think it's worth putting them out. And then Kevin, I'll let you give a little bit of your background and story. As my sort of background, where I have focused most of my time and education and research is in the area of metaphysics and philosophy of religion. And I think when you roll up your sleeves and you work really hard on philosophy of God and philosophical anthropology, it sets you up with certain expectations. For one thing, I think good metaphysics leads to a very robust conception of God, of classical theism, of divine simplicity. And as it happens, it's a conception of God that the Catholic Church sort of dogmatically teaches, in fact. So that's a point of convergence that I felt was very strongly in favor of the Catholic worldview. Now, there are, of course, Protestants who hold to divine simplicity, so it doesn't rule out all Protestantism. But for me, it ruled out a lot because there's a lot of Protestants who deny these types of commitments. Another thing that I feel was really important, Kevin, was just thinking about human nature and the nature of revelation. Humans are rational animals, but we're also rational, social, dependent animals that tend towards hierarchy and authority and tradition. So if God's going to reveal something and he's going to will an end, he's always going to sort of will a means that's appropriate to the thing in question for that end. He's always going to work with things according to their nature. I think this is a deep metaphysical truth. So something like the Catholic faith makes a lot of sense philosophically, given human nature, given how God might try to relate or reveal things to us. It makes sense that he would not only work with tradition, and authority, which are, I think, just, again, that's just what it means to be human, right? All of our epistemology is bound up with tradition and authority. God, it just seems to me, would work with that. However, because revelation is so important, it seems like he would put some fail-safes in, if we can put it that way, like something really authoritative, something like a magisterium, indeed, with a chief executive, right? So what I'm saying is just a lot of good philosophical background and back work, I think, points really strongly, if not decisively, in the direction of the Catholic faith, if there is a true religion and if there is historical data to support it. And then from there, of course, I'm going to argue that the early attestation of sacramentality, the early attestation of apostolic authority, the early attestation of the papacy, of the papal claims, all this is really well explained, right, by the Catholic hypothesis. Indeed, it's something that you would expect if Catholicism is true. And it's something that I think is really difficult to deal with if you think Catholicism is false. there's other things that really convinced me as well. One is just, I think this is sometimes overlooked, is the sheer endurance of the Catholic Church. Even when I was a sort of outsider to religion, it just struck me like, wow, it's really remarkable that most people recognize the Catholic Church as like the oldest institution around, right? Why is this behemoth still here, right? Well, if Catholicism is true, the Catholic hypothesis predicts Catholic endurance, right? It predicts that Christ's church will prevail against the gates of hell, that it will not go the way of every other sort of bloated bureaucratic institution, right? So Catholic endurance is not surprising if the Catholic hypothesis is true. I would say it's quite surprising, darn surprising, if Catholicism isn't true. So this is what I'm highlighting here, is a sort of methodology, an abductive methodology to the inference to the best explanation, where certain data points, events, occurrences, experiences, right, if they're sort of better expected on one hypothesis, or here's a way of putting it, right? What is the likelihood that this event or experience or occurrence would occur if this hypothesis were true? And what is the likelihood that it would occur if this hypothesis were not true, either with or without the hypothesis? And so what I've been kind of getting at here is there's a lot of data that I think is just the sort of thing that you would expect if Catholicism is true. It's not the sort of thing you would expect if Catholicism is false. And it was, for me anyways, largely the cumulative force of all this data that really just made it, I think, overwhelmingly clear to me that if I'm going to be a Christian, I just have to be a Catholic. And then, of course, there's other confirmatory signs, such as Eucharistic miracles. We'll talk about those a little bit here as well. And Fatima. So it wasn't just one thing, right? Many, many, many different things, all pointing toward the same direction, and nothing really pointing away from it, at least strongly, for me. I mean, every worldview, every paradigm has its anomalies, it has its tensions here and there. But in terms of where does the overwhelming force of the evidence point and lean, it seemed to me, again, as an outsider, trying to just take a fair survey of the options within Christianity, the Catholic hypothesis. It always feels kind of cheeky calling it a hypothesis, right? This was like, seemed almost screamingly obvious, right? So there's my opening gambit, and that should give people an idea of the type of approach we're going to be advocating here for. And we're going to really focus in on Fatima, actually, because I think this is a really powerful piece of evidence, a really powerful confirmatory sign. But let me pause there, Kevin, and let's get some of your relevant background for this conversation, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And anything you want to build on that I just said, by the way.
Well, actually, yeah, when you were talking about, the Catholic Church outliving all these institutions, I just saw the other day an old meme. It showed a picture of one of the symbols for the church, and it said the Catholic Church outlasting oppressive government since 33 AD. So it was one of those things flying around Facebook some years ago, but now it's kind of, I don't know, it might make a comeback, but yeah. So it's, we straddle the line here between revelation and philosophy, of course. But when Jesus says, that the church is he's going to be establishing this church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well then if the church was established at the moment when Christ's side was pierced, and that's when the fathers of the church say that the church was born, was in that moment. Well, then if the gates of hell will not prevail, then we know that the church is going to last. It's going to continue at least until Christ comes once more, or once again. So where is that church? If we look at historically, if it goes from roughly about 33 AD, it would have to endure to our day. So the question is, where is it, and how do you identify it? Well, of course, in Catholic theology, that we have all these things like the 4 marks of the church: one, Holy, Catholic, Apostolic. But still, we have those sorts of things that are coming into play here. And our focus today is going to be a little bit about how miracles as confirmatory signs, or confirmatory signs, I should say. So, we see these happen over time. But before we get into that, as you said, a little bit about myself. I'm 40 years old. I live in North Dakota. I was born, actually, ironically, I was born and raised in the greater Boston area, though I have long since lost my accent. Unless I have to yell and roar, otherwise raise my voice. Then you hear me about parking the car and all that. But in 1999, I started my college studies. That was 2 years after I became Catholic. I'm a convert myself, at age 15 back in March of 97. So this month will be 25 years. And that's kind of how God got me into the church, actually, was through miraculous things like apparitions and visions and, things happening with the rosary and things of that nature. That's kind of the hook, that I like to say, that God used to get my attention.
Yeah.
So I graduated in high school in 99, went to college to study theology. And I had a background with the classical languages already because of some apologetics work that I was doing at the time. So I wanted to get to know the writings of the fathers and the scriptures more, hence the classical language background with Greek and Latin. So that was for 4 years, and then to 03, and then 03 to 06, I was studying for my master's degree, also in theology. And since then, I've held a variety of jobs, from washing, bussing tables at a restaurant, to my present job, working for a Catholic apostolate. But on my personal interest still always remains with what the church calls the theology of private revelation. So that's things like miracles, apparitions, visions, locutions, miraculous sorts of things. And related to that are manifestations, things like Eucharistic miracles, the stigmata, when people claim to have the wounds of Christ on their hands, their feet, and their side, maybe even around their head for the crown of thorns. Demonology is another area that's also of interest, because it's all connected. The devil could deceive people with some of these miraculous things, so you have to have some understanding of demonology as well as other areas of theology.
Right.
Which incidentally, I would say is one of the proofs of the Catholic Church's endurance over the years. Is she's had now 2,000 years to hammer out a lot of this theology, and we have such a richness and a depth to draw from in that great tradition that really does help us through some of these particularly murky times that we're going through right now, especially right now with the situation over, in the Ukraine with Russia there. So, we have this beautiful tradition that gives us that hope. And my understanding is we're going to be going into that a little bit more today, but in a precise thing with respect to miracles and visions and stuff in Fatima.
Right. So since our video is part of a much wider project, I wanted to focus in on something specific. And I think Fatima is a great example, because the argument that we're going to be making is that Fatima is not surprising. In fact, it's something that we would expect if Catholicism is true. It's not something that we would expect if Catholicism is not true. So we can say it's a modest C inductive argument. And in fact, there's a really good paper making this argument by Dr. Tyler McNabb, who himself is a convert to Catholicism. So I'll make sure that resource is available for people who want to get into some of the technical details of how this type of reasoning works. It's really actually an extension of the reasoning used in Richard Swinburne's very famous book, The Existence of God, which I highly recommend for really anybody who's interested in the philosophical case for God in general. But again, it's a very sort of basic and widely used methodology, and abductive methodology. We're trying to make an inference for the best explanation. We're not saying that this evidence like definitively proves that we should 100% certainty that Catholicism is true. It's just that it's a weight in the scale. And what I want to say, it's a quite significant weight. And it's interesting to hear that part of your backstory, Kevin, where this is sort of what really tipped the scales for you. And I want to argue that if somebody is sort of on the fence, so to speak, it should tip the scales for you as well, because this is really powerful evidence, I think, for the truth of the Catholic hypothesis. Now, before we get into that, when we're making these types of comparisons, we do have to think about sort of background knowledge. All right, what's already being assumed here? And in this type of conversation, what's already being assumed is that some form of Christianity is true, right? That God exists and some form of Christianity is true. So miracles are on the table. We're not arguing with the reductive physicalist here. Miracles are on the table. People in this conversation already believes that there's at least been, the core miracles of the sort of mere Christianity. And now we're trying to ask, okay, if we're in the hallway, as C.S. Lewis calls it, of mere Christianity, we do have to pick a door. C.S. Lewis says that you have to pick a door, right? what door should we pick? We're saying that when you look through the history, after, of course, the resurrection of our Lord, what we find are a powerful series of confirmatory signs. And in fact, I think this is something of a tradition that needs to be revived, because Catholic apologists used to be much more, I think, spirited about presenting confirmatory signs as evidence for the Catholic faith, and that fell away somewhat, I feel like, in the past 100 years. But I have to say, as personally, these were very convicting for me. So what I think we need to discuss, Kevin, and what we need to establish are a couple of things here to make this argument have force for the Catholic hypothesis. One is we have to at least detail enough of Fatima to show that it's credible as a truly miraculous event, right? That this is something that is highly resistant to any sort of naturalistic explanation or being explained away from a naturalistic standpoint. I think that's easily done for anybody who really looks into this case with an open mind, but we're going to go through some of that right now. But even more than that, I think we have to give enough detail about Fatima to show that this isn't a mere Christianity occurrence, right? That Fatima has the marks of Catholicism all over it, right? That this is a sort of distinctly Catholic miracle that really does, it's a divine wink, if you will. Like, it's clearly pointing to the truth of the Catholic faith by affirming core Catholic commitments, very traditional Catholic teachings, Catholic devotions, practices, spiritual practices. And in that sense, it's not, I want to argue, it's not something a Protestant should be comfortable with. This is clearly something that is I think, strongly indicative of Catholic truth. And from there, I think once that's realized, as we'll try to establish here, the Protestants kind of stuck in an awkward position, because if it is the case that there's not a sort of easily available naturalistic explanation here, and this has the marks of Catholicism all over it, it does seem like the Protestant is going to have to, and I've heard many Protestants make this argument, go for really a demonic explanation of Fatima, right? They're really going to have to try and say, okay, yeah, this is not something natural, but it's also not from the good team, right? That's how they're going to have to try and deal with this. And I've seen Protestants make that move before. In fact, that seems to be the typical move that I've seen the more philosophically educated Protestants make on Fatima, because they see how resistant this is to a naturalistic explanation. So they really have to say that it's some sort of trick of the devil. And I think that's a huge bullet to bite for reasons I'm sure we'll get into. So that's my general framing of where I want to go with this, Kevin. Anything else you want to say before we start getting into details?
We should probably say first begin with what Fatima is before we get into more of the specifics.
Let's do it. Give us the background that we need to know, because we don't want to assume that people are totally familiar. So what is this Fatima thing, and why should we think that that this isn't just some like mass hallucination or something like that?
Well, Fatima is a little town, well, back then at least was a little town in Portugal, about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of Lisbon in Portugal. And in 1917, between May and October of that year, the Blessed Virgin appeared to 3 young shepherd children, Lucia dos Santos, Francisco and Jacinta Marto. Francisco and Jacinta were brother and sister, and both were cousins to Lucia. And like I said, the Virgin Mary appeared to them and issued what some people call like a call or a message, calling people to, especially the children, to prayer, repentance, sacrificing for sinners, those kinds of praying the rosary. She also had very specific requests for the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart, the instituting of what she called the Communion of Reparation of the 5 First Saturdays, which was a devotion rooted in Our Lady. And then then there was some information, very specific information that was communicated in July 13th of 1917, known as the Secret of Fatima. It was one secret in 3 parts. It was very controversial because, you talk about human nature earlier. Well, what was it that Aristotle said at the very beginning of the Metaphysica? All human beings by nature desire to know. Well, if someone's got a secret, what thing is going to get triggered in you? So they definitely kind of got that, but then everything kind of culminated in October during the final apparition in that series. That's a series of 6 apparitions in this miracle called the miracle of the sun, and that's where the sun moved out way out of for what it would normally would in the sky. Some people described it as like dancing in the sky, or just moving around. However, different descriptions, but the idea was the sun was way off of its orbit and axis and everything else. And then at one point, the sun looked like it was come crashing into the earth, and people were confessing their sins openly. I mean, it was quite the scene. And then the sun went back to its normal place in the sky, and suddenly everybody looked around, and their clothes were bone dry. It had been downpouring prior to this event with the sun, and the ground and the clothes were everything was all dry. And different people, as indicated, saw something differently. Some people didn't see anything at all, though few, but still recorded. So there was a big investigation, and the church approved these things as from God in October of 1930. And it's been, a story that's been told now for 105 years. So that's the general backstory.
Yeah, if you don't mind, there's a couple summary paragraphs in Dr. McNabb's paper that I want to read, and then I want you to fill in any other details you think are important for people to understand before we keep going deeper. How's that sound?
Sure.
Yeah, I just found this a really helpful summary for people who might be new. So the miracle of Fatima. In the early 1900s, Christianity in Portugal was predicted to become extinct. Seminaries were closing, and very few people were joining the priesthood. Portugal, from a Catholic in Portugal's point of view, needed a major revival. The apparitions of Mary to the children and the miracle that occurred at Fatima helped meet this need. Broken down, there were a total of 9 appearances to the 3 shepherd children involved in the events at Fatima. The first 3 of which were appearances of the guardian angel of Portugal. Pretty Catholic commitment, right? And the latter 6 of which were the Virgin Mary. During the 3 appearances of the guardian angel, the angel encouraged the children to fervently pray to the hearts of Jesus and Mary as the angels offered them the Eucharist. Again, you can see the sort of distinctive marks of Catholicism all over this already. The angel proclaimed to them, "Take and drink of the body and blood of Jesus Christ, horribly outraged by ungrateful men. Make reparation for their crimes and console your God." Soon afterwards, on May 13th, the Virgin Mary appears to the children for the first time. Mary tells them that she comes from heaven and that she wants to continue to meet them every 13th of each month for 6 months. During the following month, June 13th, Mary appears again and openly proclaims that one of the shepherd children, Lucia, will soon be alone, meaning the others will die, and that she would have to spread a devotion to her immaculate heart. Again, very Catholic. During the third appearance, word of the Marian appearances had spread, and some 2,000 to 3,000 people gathered at the site where Mary would appear to the children. When Mary appears, she shows the children a vision of hell and calls them once again to establish a devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Now, obviously, many Christians are committed to the traditional understanding of hell, but this might be a problem here for Universalist Christians, right? We seem to be getting a strong reaffirmation of, again, the traditional.
I was actually thinking of talking about this as one of our talking points about the truths of Catholicism in relation to hell. Yeah. So if that's something we could talk about,
we'll get there. Yeah. Let me get the highlight, and then I want to keep diving into each of these points. Okay. So continue on from Dr. McNabb's paper. He says the 4th appearance, August the 13th, does not go as planned, as the children's civil administrator intervenes and kidnaps the children until August 15th. One by one, the civil administrator takes the children into a room and threatens to kill them unless they share a secret, which the children claim the Virgin entrusted with them. All 3 children, however, consistently keep to their testimony that the Virgin Mary had been appearing to them, thus seemingly vindicating the sincerity of their beliefs. Mary again appears to the children after the incident on the 19th of that month and encourages them again to do penance for the sins of the world. The fifth appearance occurs on September the 13th, where Mary proclaims the importance of citing the rosary. The subsequent month, it rained all day prior to the appearance and up until the predicted appearance at noon. Around noon, the raining stopped and the sun came out. Here, most who were at Fatima at the time, roughly 50 to 100,000 people, saw something fantastic. The standard story is that the crowd, without pain, looked upon the sun or something that looked like the sun and saw the sun turn multiple colors and dance and do all the things that Kevin described. It was widely reported that the sun ended up moving towards the crowd as if it were about to crash. Then right before it appeared like it was going to hit the earth, the sun just returned to normal. There is some disagreement about exactly what happened. For example, some of the witnesses debated whether the sun moved, and some, like Kevin said, claimed, some but few claimed that they didn't see anything at all. Regardless, the vast majority agreed that something inexplicable happened, something unexplainable happened. And it is also widely reported that while the crowds were still staring into the sky, everything, their clothes became completely dry within minutes. Shocked by all of this, the common belief in Fatima was that a real miracle had occurred, and what followed that was a robust revival throughout Portugal. Kevin, anything else you think is essential to that brief summary of Fatima?
No, actually, I didn't realize he had written it. That was actually a pretty good overall take on it.
So the nice thing about this paper, which I'll make sure again is available in the resources, is that he spends a fair amount of time refuting the typical proposed possible natural explanations to this. And I think I don't think that that's too difficult to do. I think when you consider all the data that has to be explained, there's really not much of a viable natural explanation, unless it's a natural explanation that's so improbable it would require divine coordination and providence to occur to begin with. So Kevin, maybe you want to just say a few things about that. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does he get into how different groups of people that were there, like non-believers and atheists? Does he mention that at all in the paper?
I don't remember if he does, but I do remember from my own research on this that a number of non-believers converted because of this experience, and that the secular newspapers at the time also reported that, yeah, maybe even if they didn't convert them, like something really happened that we don't have an explanation for. Is that correct?
Basically, yes. Because he kind of touches upon, the condition of the faith at that time. Well, they had suffered their own revolution. I think it was around 1910. And and Freemasons had taken over, and they were and other what they were called free thinkers of the day, and they were trying to destroy the Catholic faith in Portugal, because Portugal was a main bastion in Europe of Catholicism in those times. Hence, it was a target for these anti-clerical groups and societies. So what happened was these secularists, free thinkers, Freemasons, they were in power basically. And when the claims of Fatima started from the children, they were mocking and deriding the children. These misguided souls that were doing this. And so when they talked about the miracle, well, of course, if you're going to claim there's going to be a miracle to verify what you say, people are going to show up en masse to either see you glorified or see you have to get taken away in chains. So that's what they did. They were present there. Scoffers, non-believers, atheists, all alike were there, along with believers. And of course, when everything happened, these people witnessed it, and they were like, yeah, I have to admit, I can't deny what I saw, and they wrote about it there was one famous article in El Século, one of the major newspapers there at the time. Avelino de Almeida, I think was his name, among other names. But that was actually one of the proofs in and of itself, I would say, is you had this huge manifestation of the supernatural in this miracle of the sun and the subsequent drying of the clothes and the dirt,
and the accurate prediction that this would occur prior to it, which is critical, right? We have to be able to explain all this data, not just any one point of it, but all of it. So we have to remember that this was something that was predicted, and it was an accurate prediction from the prior experiences that the children had, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they were unlettered children. I mean, they were. I don't want to. This sounds, because in English it sounds horrible, but because it has the negative connotation. But I mean, basically, from today's standards, we would have called the three children country bumpkins. You know, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, because Jacinto and Francisco are canonized, recognized saints, and Lucy is on her way to being recognized as such. So I don't mean any disrespect. I'm just simply saying they were the children from the hills. You know, they didn't have a high level of education at that time. I mean, none of them even knew how to read or write, really. So predicting that there was going to be this major event at this day, at this time, 3 months, at like 4 months in advance. I mean, you're either going to be proven right or go down in ignominy. You know, there's no other option here. But it happened. God demonstrated it, and I think also there was a later proof, I think, through the symbolism of it, because some of the predictions involved World War II. Our Lady specified another and worse, if her requests were not heeded, another and worse war would break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. And here we are talking about the sun, right? Well, mankind had risen to such a height of pride and arrogance, dare I say, that now we had control over the bomb, right? The nuclear bomb. And what is that kind of based on? Things like the sun, right? Like nuclear fusion and things like that. So in a way, it was almost like, I think, God kind of showing off, saying, "Aha, yeah, you all think you know what's going on. Well, I'm still in charge here, you know." And then he does this with the sun to ultimately, I think, in a way, indirectly show. I mean, this is my opinion, of course, but I think he was doing, in a way, it's symbolic of God telling us indirectly, no, I am the creator, not you. I am the one who commands these things, not you. You participate, but you do not command. You are not the Lord, you are a steward. Think of kind of like Gandalf when he's engaging with Denethor in Lord of the Rings. When Denethor is trying to deny Aragorn to come back, and Gandalf says, "Authority is not given you to deny the return of the king, steward." And Denethor gets all mad, and because he knows his place. Well, it's like us. We want to rise in pride, but we've got this wise figure, okay, God. I guess you could, if you want to make an analogy, telling us no, and here's your actual place. So I think that's a further sign, but it was very subtle, and that's often how God works. Through this big, huge thing, but there's also certain subtlety to it as well. I personally believe that's further confirmation that this is God and the supernatural.
Right. Yeah. So I think that one could give a sort of meteorological accounts, right, for the particular events at Fatima, like Yaki does, and that's considered in the paper. But that isn't a competitive explanation. That's a compatible one, because we have to explain everything forward and backwards from there, including the prediction that this would occur, why such really an unfathomably improbable occurrence would have happened with all those people there at that particular time, the sincere beliefs of the children having seen Mary and the guardian angel, the prediction that it did happen when it was predicted to, and then the forward predictions afterwards. I think you have to throw your hands up and say, yes, something beyond the natural is needed to explain what happened at Fatima, if you're being honest about it. Mm-hmm.
No, exactly. And I happen to have Father Yaki's books here on the subject.
Right.
But,
so I'm actually giving him a nod, saying I think part of his explanation can be used, but it's not a competitive, it's a compatible one. Would you agree with that? Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. He's certainly not. He's not trying to, demystify or anything. He's trying to help us to understand things better, because the one thing that this is why we have to make sure that we include, when we talk about the miracle of the sun, it is necessary to include that detail about the drying of the ground and the clothes, because Father Yaki, I mean, and basing himself upon other scholars that have gone before him, and there's actually a guy in Portugal, Bernardo Mota, who has done some really good work putting these sources together and explaining what their vision of the science behind it was. He's a good guy from what anything I could tell. He and I talk every so often. But the long and short of it is, Father Yaki and others, that's still unexplainable about the ground. And when I was visiting Fatima, a friend of mine who used to live there, he has since gone to God, but he took great care to remind me that. He's like, Kevin, you remember, you have to emphasize this. He's like, there were two parts to this: the sun itself, but well, he said two, but I guess three if you include the prediction itself. But that other part being what happened with the ground, because explaining things from a meteorological perspective, in terms of atmosphere and certain things that might make it plausible to explain how people saw that's all fine and good, but you can't explain 3 children predicting it in advance and the ground becoming dry along with everybody's clothes. Right. You just can't be that's not possible in terms of meteorological. It defies all known laws of physics.
Yeah, and it's I just want to make a quick kind of, I guess, distinction of how because miracles are sometimes used very broadly, right? And sometimes a miraculous event can just be something that could have a natural explanation, meaning like there's nothing that's required to go over and above the natural powers of something for an occurrence, but it's just so highly improbable that it would coordinate or result in the event that actually occurs. Think about like the parting of the Red Sea. Like maybe there could be, a natural explanation to that, but it's so highly improbable that would have occurred with various winds or whatever at the exact time that it did, right when it needed to happen, that clearly, even if you don't need anything over and above sort of the powers of nature for that to happen, it's just so obvious that this was coordinated by God, right, through instrumental causality. Whereas there's other miracles where it's clear that the natural powers are not adequate, right? That there's something supernatural has to come in and elevate it, right? It's over and above. And I think it is fair to call both of those miracles, but there is a distinction between the two, right? Where one, you could give a purely, I guess, natural explanation of saying, okay, it's within the power of the natural phenomena in question to bring this about. It just is so highly improbable that they would ever do that or coordinate in this way, apart from providence. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm.
I do, yeah, and I know with the case of Moses and the Israelites in the Red Sea, that there's been some talk about how there was a certain area of the Red Sea where, like a land bridge can form under the right weather conditions or something.
Right.
Because even something like cancer, it is possible. I mean, from as it has been explained to me, I admit I might be wrong, but right now, all of us have at least a cancer cell in our body. That's how it's been explained to me. But our body has natural defenses to destroy those cells. So, if we have a certain natural capacity, presuming that we are a healthy individual functioning well already, there's no dis-ease in us that would allow for these cells to get worse. Then we have a certain mechanism within us already. So if we have a miraculous healing, let's say, of somebody from cancer, it could be God in his grace quickening a natural healing ability. It could be God. It could be straight up God, removing it. Like I know some people who it's a married couple, and it was the wife's father. He was completely cured of cancer. He went in April, I think around 2014 or 2015, I want to say, maybe 2016. And he went in April. They told him what his diagnosis was. It was wrapping around his spine. It was on his lung. I mean, he had only so long to live. Well, he told his family for the next 2 months, they were praying, working the beads, as we say, praying the rosary, asking Our Lady's intercession. And all he was doing was taking his normal blood pressure medication. Well, the guy goes back to the doctor after, I think it was in June of that year. So about 2 months later, the doctor comes back in, x-rays in hand. He's noticeably like shaken. And he's like, I can't explain this, but you don't have cancer anymore. There's not even scar tissue on your lungs, because cancer is a carcinogenic. So there's no scar tissue. How do you explain that? The guy, I think, was in his 70s at the time. How do you explain that in a 70-something-year-old man? It could be God's grace working to remove it entirely and healing him to such a way where he was back to a normal condition,
Yes.
or maybe God accelerating a natural healing process. I mean, it is all different. It just depends upon
Right.
the divine.
I think part of the problem here is people think that like God and nature are in competition sometimes, and that's of course the completely wrong metaphysical view. Sometimes people think that God can't intervene to be violations of the laws of nature. And Herbert McCabe has a good quote on this. He says, "Look, the reason God can't violate or intervene isn't because God doesn't have enough power. It's because he has too much, right? The only reason that there are natures at all at any given instant is only because of God's causal divine influx, right? So it's totally wrong to think of God who as the entity that sort of flicks this first domino and then this sort of independent thing called nature just takes its course, right? And then maybe God pokes a finger in here or there. No, God is the live musician who's just improvising all the time. And he can take things in any direction that he wants at any time because everything is always continuously dependent upon the creative activity of God. And so I think there's just a lot of just philosophical confusions, deeper ones that I think cause problems when people are thinking about miracles that don't need to be there and shouldn't be there. Now, I think some miracles are just of a different class or category than others. Surely the resurrection, right, would be different than just things that we think are just really highly improbable to occur that we'd say, okay, that's miraculous, but really mean that's just a divine wink according to providence or something like that. But the general point is God and nature are clearly not in competition. There's the divine transcendent causality, and then there's the natures and the agents that he puts in operation, right? And everything is putty in God's hands at the end of the day, right?
Well, what's the famous Thomistic expression, grace built upon nature? You said God is constantly improvising. I'd be a little careful about using that word improvising because, you got to factor in divine providence, foreseeing everything in advance. But,
well, I use improvise as
the
highest compliment of who can improvise well. Well, the expert musician. Nobody's more expert than God and his executive knowledge. So yes, I understand what you're saying, but yeah, good point. All right, so let's do this real quick, Kevin, because I want to get more into the Catholic details of Fatima. Because again, I think that it is highly resistant to any natural explanation, and people can, if they're dubious of that, I think an independent investigation will quickly alleviate that concern. But my friend Timothy McGrew, he focuses in epistemology, and he's said a number of things on miracles. He actually has the criteria that's helpful for determining when and how we have a sort of prima facie reason to doubt the miracle claim. Right. So let me list his criteria and then show why I think Fatima easily clears all these hurdles. Right. So his first claim is that this would be a reason to doubt the miracle claim. Right. So his first one is that the miracle is reported only long after it is alleged to occur or at a great distance from where it is alleged to occur. Right. So that's sort of a red flag. Right. Second one, and I'm quoting now, when the report would have been permitted to pass without examination, either because such examination would have been impossible in the nature of the case, say with regard to an event that would leave no public traces, or because the local population would have no motive to inquire its truth or falsehood, because, for instance, maybe it fell in with their own prejudices, whatever they are. 3, when no remotely worthy end could have been served if it had really happened, meaning it answers no deep questions. There's no religious significance to it. Nothing. It speaks nothing about our destiny or origin or morality. No striking teachings are confirmed. No divine commission endorsed, anything like that. Now, here's the thing. Tim, God bless him. He's a Protestant. But it seems like Fatima easily clears all those hurdles without a doubt. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think on that third one, that I think what all these really simply saying is what would the Catholic theologian would say, which is if it's dull, bland, and insipid. Those 3 words: dull, bland, and insipid. That's kind of if there's no real meat and potatoes to it. Right. It's just one of the big ones.
Right. That somebody just says, "Oh, I just saw a miracle. A pink elephant was walking down the street." What significance does that have? Right. I mean, maybe it's not dull, but what possible, it's completely out of the blue. There's no saying? Or morally significant context. It doesn't seem to.
No, certainly not.
You see what I'm saying?
you're entirely very, very charitable by say like by going for the philosophical question, what purpose does that serve? My first question would be to the person, how much have you had to drink today?
Right. Okay, so quickly before we start moving into the Catholic marks of Fatima, let's just see how Fatima clears these hurdles. One is Fatima was immediately and enormously well attested. It was subject to massive scrutiny right from the beginning, right? And it has profound religious significance. And as we're about to show, it confirms many of the core Catholic beliefs and issues dire warnings about what will happen if humanity would continue to sin, other further predictions, which Kevin talked about. So I think even by this good criteria that Dr. McGrew lays out, we have no sort of upfront reason to doubt Fatima. It is seriously worthy of investigation. And as we investigate deeper, we realize, okay, can't explain this naturally. Looks like we need a supernatural explanation. And then here's where we kind of come to the crux of the issue. If we do accept that this is really something from the good team, as we say, what do we do with all of its Catholicity, right? Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, then we either have to become Catholic or admit that this like points to the truth of Catholicism, or we have to find an alternative explanation that isn't naturalistic, meaning we're gonna have to look at some sort of demonic explanation. And that seems to me to pretty much kind of squeeze out all the options there, unless you can think I'm missing of something, Kevin.
No, I mean, there's a lot there already, but the first one that kind of comes to my mind before I got to say it before I forget it, but you were talking about in terms of the criteria there, you know, it begin like when it comes to all these things that happen immediately that testify to it. One of the things that oftentimes gets shoved to the side is precisely the suffering that the children went through. That's actually an authentication of it, not only because it confirms when Our Lady says, do you wish to offer yourselves to God, you know, but also when they accepted, Sheila said, then you will have much to suffer, but the grace of God will be your comfort. And that it was manifestly true throughout the rest of their lives. You can clearly see it in Lucia's writings. But the fundamental point there being that in terms of Catholic versus Protestant theology, that it's making suffering worthwhile. It turns it into something. It's not just, oh, I got to white knuckle it and grin and bear it because, you know, Jesus said so. No. When we unite ourselves to the sufferings of Christ as members of the mystical body, suffering takes on a new meaning. Yes. You know, and for the salvation of ourselves, hopefully, I certainly hope so, but also that of others. We call that redemptive suffering in Catholic theology. And so that beautiful point that you mentioned, you know, a couple of minutes ago, you know, I think it kind of, you know, things being attested to right then and there, the suffering of the children. And it proves what Our Lady had said. And it happened immediately because nobody believed. I mean, at one point, Lucia's mother took the broomstick to her, you know, and like tries to she's like, basically like, I'll beat the lies out of you, you know. Lucia suffered an awful lot, as well as Francisco and Jacinta before their deaths.
Yeah.
It confirms what that aspect.
So I want to bring up one other thing that might be a possible objection here, and that are like miracles outside of Christianity. Well, the cool thing here is that the Catholic Church affirms that, you know, God's grace can operate wherever God wants it to, including, you know, among our Protestant brothers and sisters. And I think it clearly does. I think you have like miraculous healings, right, that we talked about. But that wouldn't be a problem for the Catholic hypothesis because the Catholic worldview allows for that. What would be a problem would be something like this. There's an apparition account. Martin Luther appears. It's on the size of Fatima. It's as well attested as Fatima. And there's like deep claims about the Pope as the Antichrist and the falsity and sort of the deceitful nature of the Catholic Church. If you had something like that, then I think Catholics would have a real problem. But as far as I've ever been able to tell, there's never been anything like that at all. And the most well-attested miracle claims that are out there, amazingly, are just like overwhelmingly Catholic. Also, just give a quick idea of what I'm talking about. Just not too long ago, Kevin, I did just a little Google search. And I just Googled the best evidenced miracles within Christianity. And immediately I got an article from history.co.uk, right? So I just clicked like the first Google thing that came up. And I said to myself, like, I'm willing to bet that almost all of these, if not most of these, would be like pretty Catholic miracles. And as it turns out, I was right. 4 out of the 5 on that site were like distinctly Catholic miracles: Lourdes, Fatima, Padre Pio, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the only exception was this Orthodox Christian woman who I had never heard of before, Vesna Vulovic, who was, have you heard of her? She's the person who survived the highest fall of all time from an airplane, right? So like seems actually pretty miraculous.
She landed on her face?
Something, but she fell out of an airplane
by the way, you're 6 weeks pregnant
from an attack. But there's nothing about that claim that is like anti-Catholic or confirmatory of another denomination. So I don't think that one's a concern. But it's funny because I did a little hypothesis testing. I said, I bet if I type this in, the best evidence miracles will be Catholic, and they were. And then I clicked the next one, which was from livescience.com. I'll make sure these resources are available. And again, what did I find? Another laundry list of peculiarly Catholic miracles, including not just Marian apparitions, crying Marian statues, bleeding Eucharistic hosts, dead saints whose bodies refused to decay. None were peculiarly Protestant. Virtually all were peculiarly Catholic. What does that tell you? Well, this is just the sorts of things we would expect if Catholicism is true, not at all the sorts of things we would expect if Catholicism is false. And in fact, if I were to see sort of miracles outside of Catholicism, if Catholicism is true, I would not expect like Martin Luther to appear and big apparitions that make anti-papal claims. If Catholicism weren't true, I might expect that, right? But what do we see? We don't see those scenarios. We see scenarios that always, or for the most part, point back to the Catholic faith, at least among the most well-attested miracle accounts we have. And I just like, how can people ignore this stuff, man? Like, it just seems so, especially when you add them all up, it seems so glaringly obvious. So sorry, that's a bit of an aside, but to me, it was really powerful when I was looking at sort of an outsider and looking at miracle claims with honest scrutiny. So Kevin, we kind of hit the highlights already, but when you're obviously somebody who spent a lot more time thinking about Fatima than I have. You have a book on it, which we'll mention at the end in your upcoming course. But what about Fatima to you do you think is so distinctly Catholic, right? Give us some of your deeper thoughts there. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Where do you begin? Well, Fatima has always struck me, but it wasn't until more recently, or particularly during the research for my book, that I kind of went a little more deeper with it. And I think one of the most fundamental things that I could point to is, a lot of people want to see the extraordinary things. I find that God often is more powerful in the small things, that it's much more profound. Kind of like, again, if I may make an analogy again to Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf is talking, I think it's to Frodo, and he's talking about how, it's the small people, like it's the everyday acts of kindness that keep evil at bay. It's kind of something similar. God reveals himself not always in this big, huge, flashy, showy way, but also in the very simple and the subtle. And the way Fatima was described by one writer, I'm drawing a blank as to who it was at the moment, but was that Fatima was an explosion of the supernatural in our world. And here we are now 105 years later, or just shy of 105 years, and we're still picking up the pieces of this. And so this explosion of the supernatural, people are still trying to figure it all out. There's been a lot of blessings, a lot of controversy too. A lot of ink has been spilled over some controversial aspects. That's what my book is actually primarily addressing, is one of those controversial aspects. But I find that it's also so simple, the message of Fatima, that I think we overly complicate it as human beings.
Right.
And it bespeaks the divine wisdom when you're studying it in depth, when you're reading what Lucia wrote about it. You can just see this thread all throughout. And that, for me at least, is one of the big, somewhat contradictory example, but glaring signs that this is God talking, because this is God acting. Because it doesn't, granted, we had this big, huge thing in the miracle of the sun, but there's a lot more to it than just that. And God speaks through these events, even now, very powerfully. And so that for me is one of the big signs that just that kind of shows that like this is like one of those supernatural character marks. If we have a checklist of things, if it's dull, bland, and insipid, like we mentioned earlier, well, just crumple the waste and throw it in the waste can. But if there's something that actually is deeper, I'm going to use the word tantalizing, but not in a goading way, but it draws you closer to God.
Yes.
Like in a romance, it's not like a tease. It's just, no, you've caught sight of the beloved, and you gravitate towards that. That's what I find, especially in the message of Fatima.
And that's going to be important, because if somebody wants to try and say that this was a trick of the devil, they're going to have to deal with all the good fruit. And I think, that's one of the ways you really, probably the only way at the end of the day you can make these types of assessments, right, is what is the fruit that comes out of something like this. And it's been enormous. It's been enormous. Like you said, it has drawn many, 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 who knows how many people at this point, right, since it first occurred, into the Catholic faith, into a much deeper relationship with God and Jesus, rather than a way that I think that's too much of a cost to bear in terms of an alternative explanation. I mean, the Protestant would have to say that, and some of them might be willing to say, that all the conversions to the Catholic faith are themselves just so evil, right? Right? But most Protestants don't want to say that these days. I mean, most Protestants are far more ecumenical. The ones that I talk to, they don't think that all Catholics go to hell or something like that. They might think that the Catholic faith is mistaken, but that Catholics at least can still be saved and stuff like that. So most Protestants these days that I talk to, I don't think would want to say that the devil just brought everyone into the Catholic Church, as that was gullible enough to believe in Fatima so that they would be damned. That just seems like far too ridiculous to be taken seriously. But
you and I might have different experiences, but sometimes I see the comments and comment features on various websites, political or religious websites. I don't know. Sometimes there are people who really get, quite frankly, nasty and vicious towards us Catholics, and I'm just kind of like, hold the phone, people, calm down. I actually met just the other day, and maybe I say this because I just actually saw it. What was it? Friday, within like yesterday or Friday. Mm-hmm. I just saw it in some of the com boxes on a political website, because the topic of religion, actually it was a topic on Fatima. It got brought up on a political website with Steve Bannon, and there was another news outlet covering it. And I saw the comments underneath, and I was just kind of like, "Oh my goodness!"
Yeah, right. And I'm
actually sad. Grieved me.
And of course, Catholics can be nasty too, right? But I'm talking about those who aren't the internet trolls, right? And it does seem to me that when you look at Fatima, it has brought enormous fruit in terms of repentance, in terms of conversion, all the things that you would expect if this is from the good team. Not at all the types of things you would expect if it's not from the good team. And that's why I think the sort of alternative explanation of pointing towards demonic activity is just, it's an untenable one. Now, let me read 2 paragraphs from Dr. McNabb from his paper that I think summarize, if you want to chime in first, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just real quick. One thing that needs to be put into focus is that in the Church's theology of private revelation, this was outlined by Pope St. Pius X in his encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, when he's talking about what he calls pious traditions, of which things like apparitions and visions they come under that heading. He reminds everybody that there's no lack of human want for arguing over these matters, and that's why in the long run they're not considered to be. You covered this earlier. They're not considered to be definitive. Right. But they're more like ancillary or like helpful proofs to back up the primary things. Yeah. And so basically that's what Pius would I think Pius X would have agreed there too. But I just wanted to point that out because maybe somebody might watch and might be saying, well, what about this? What about that? What if it is the devil? And this is where we go back and forth in that argument. Pius points this out. And that's why when the Church approves something, there's not the mark of infallibility to it. It's simply saying that this appears by all indications to be from God, and it is a help that God seems to be giving us in a particular moment, a difficult moment.
And you are free to assent to it.
We are free under, and there's no pain of sin. If somebody, like, if I don't do, let's say, the 5 first Saturdays, I have, by the way, don't get me wrong. The first 5 was just yesterday, actually, but you know, if you don't do it, it's not like you're going to go to hell for not doing that. You know, we go to hell for, you know, committing mortal sin, or, you know, or doing other terrible things, but not because you didn't do.
But Catholics are not bound to accept Fatima, right? Is what you're saying. So good. All right, let me read these 2 final paragraphs, and we'll get some closing thoughts. I think this just summarizes the case really well, as Dr. McNabb puts it. First, given our evidence, the content of the Marian message and the angel's message possess unique elements to the Roman Catholic tradition. These elements include consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and to praying the Rosary. With respect to one, the consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary is seen as a specific dedication to the intercession of Mary, where one attaches oneself to Jesus more fully through Mary's intercessory prayer. Although this works nicely with the Marian thesis on our background knowledge, nevertheless, this particular form of dedication to Marian intercession has been uniquely observed by the Roman Catholic tradition for many centuries. With respect to praying the Rosary consists of a set of prayers that is uniquely Roman Catholic, and that has been both said in the Roman Catholic tradition for ages, and it conveys what would become the uniquely defined Roman Catholic dogma of the Assumption of Mary. So we can't forget about that aspect as well. Second, we should expect that, he brings up the Martin Luther thing. Second, we should expect that if a figure who represents a specific Christian tradition appears, then it would give credence, meaning it should raise our confidence, to the truth of that tradition, assuming the figure does not denounce that tradition. For instance, if Martin Luther appeared with a message from God, then many would consider this to be evidence that the Protestant tradition is correct over the Roman Catholic tradition. Or if John Calvin showed up with a message from God, then this would serve as evidence that the Reformed Protestant tradition is correct over other Protestant traditions and the Roman Catholic one as well. Likewise, the fact that God chose Mary to reveal his message in a Roman Catholic context, that is a context where heavy Marian devotion is both common and seen as biblical, gives us evidence that the Roman Catholic tradition is correct. I'm very moved by this evidence, and Fatima was very moving to me. It just seemed so clear. So it seemed like such an obvious divine wink that I wanted to share my personal reflections, Dr. McNabb's paper, and the insights of Kevin here for everyone to seriously consider this, and also to consider the cumulative case, the cumulative force, not just of all the biblical data and the data from the church fathers and the philosophical background we talk about, but all the sort of confirmatory signs down through history, the apparitions, the Eucharistic miracles, the holy lives of saints, the non-decaying bodies of saints, all of it, and just ask, what is the best way to explain all this? And so far as I can tell, there is no better way than just admitting that the Catholic hypothesis is true. So those would be my final thoughts on the matter. Kevin, what else would you want to say about this? What else do you want to leave people with? And then let's make sure that we mention some of your upcoming projects as well.
All right. Well, I'm not sure how to, like, what will be like closing thoughts. So I'll just kind of go, from the heart here briefly. But, as I said earlier, what interests me with Fatima is a number of things, but among it just being the simplicity of the message. And the heart of it is going back to the basics, but specifically when God offers through his mother this devotion to her Immaculate Heart, Our Lady says it will be the pathway that will lead the children, but also by extension, those who practice the devotion, to God. And I think it's so simple, again, because if this goes back to the Marian dogmas of the Immaculate Conception, in particular, the Immaculate Conception being without sin. And so if she was without sin and full of grace, she fully reflects God. And so if we are called to imitate her Immaculate Heart, then that's living the Beatitude. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God, And as mankind was going away from God with all that secularism, materialism, and communism and atheism, God is offering us the path of his mother's Immaculate Heart, which is a straight shot to him because of her purity and her grace, you know, given to her by God, of course, not by her own merit, but still it's in place. And so when we follow that path, it's again, the simplicity of it, you know, and people would gradually or wholeheartedly convert as they begin to live this. And that's something I just want to leave with people, is having that devotion and really what that means. It's an underrated aspect of the message of Fatima. And as we're living it, we begin to develop that interior attitude of the Blessed Mother. And it fulfills kind of what St. Louis de Montfort talked about on the subject in his true devotion to Mary. And as such, when we're living it, we are witnesses to the love of God, which in and of itself is attractive and draws people, which is necessary in our times. So that's why it all just kind of comes together. It's like a zipper, you know, everything just was falling into place, you know, with Fatima. And that's where it's like, okay, you have to know that this is God, because everything just comes into place, you know. That would be some closing thoughts I wish to offer for the audience.
Beautiful reflection. So let's finish up now. I will make sure that William lists all the resources for the gentle listener to dive into. There's been a number of sources that I've been inspired by and borrowing from throughout this brief conversation, going all the way back to Richard Swinburne and how he makes his cumulative case apologetic. Dr. McNabb's excellent article on Fatima as a C-inductive argument for the Catholic faith. We mentioned Father Yaki and his work. I also want to mention Father Spitzer has done a fair amount of work on the veracity of Fatima as well. So we'll make sure all those resources included. If you want to check out what I'm doing, you can come over to Philosophy for the People on YouTube. So I host a philosophy YouTube channel with my friend Dr. Jim Madden. And we're always kind of looking through a Catholic lens, but exploring the great philosophical ideas. And we do a fair amount of apologetic work over there as well, especially on the sort of theism, atheism debates. So that's what I'm up to. You can check me out at Philosophy for the People on YouTube or philosophyforthepeople.com. Kevin, I know you have a book on Fatima and a course that you're working on. So why don't you mention those quickly?
Sure. I have a book that came out in 2017 called On the Third Part of the Secret of Fatima. Earlier, I mentioned there was the secret in 3 parts, and that there was some mystery to it. And the third part was one of the biggest mysteries of all. And there's been some controversy surrounding it earlier that I kind of touched upon lightly earlier. So this book is getting into those controversies and discussing them and trying to show where some of those areas were a bit mistaken, respectfully speaking, they're mistaken, but still. And then on March 14th, I'm kickstarting a course based upon my book. It's called a MOOC, a massive open online course. It's open to anybody, and just talking about these issues and helping people to understand better what happened with this controversial aspect of Fatima, but also get to know the message and the greater call of Our Lady at Fatima. So those were you'll find information about that on my website if anybody's interested. It's just www.kevinsymonds.com. So just my first and last name.com.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and we hope that you found this video helpful.